First children break their silence on hard copy.
Frequent flyer, Advantage miles, buy one seat and take a companion along for free, buy club class and we'll upgrade you to first. It's become a way of life in the air, but the question persists, if they're giving away all this free service, are they cutting back on maintenance to pay for it? The airlines say no. They brag about how well they maintain their planes. However, Hawaiian Airlines would have a tough time bragging about how it maintained its planes. If you flew Hawaiian Airlines during a 3-month period last year, you were flying an airline that the Defense Department had determined was not safe enough to fly troops, and the General Services Administration blackballed as too dangerous for federal employees to fly. Yet the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, not only didn't ground the airline, they didn't tell the public what a senior FAA maintenance inspector told us.
It wasn't a well-functioning airline.
Had you had the power, would you have let them continue to fly?
No, I would have suspended their certificate.
If you saw an airplane that you thought was dangerous, could you stop that?
Yes, the individual inspector, the safety inspector, has the authority to ground an individual airplane for a period of 5 days.
But when it comes to an airline, you can't ground an entire airline.
No, you can only make a recommendation.
How well trained were their people?
Some people had pretty good training. Other people had no training.
And these were mechanics servicing planes?
These were mechanics.
And Tom Seeley, who worked as one of those mechanics at Hawaiian Airlines, went further.
It's just God's miracle that they have not had a major accident. But the way that they run things, it surprises me why they didn't have one long ago.
On July 14th, 1987, Tom Seeley was working here as an airplane mechanic for Hawaiian Airlines, helping his partner with a routine tire change on a DC-9 when they discovered that a part of the main landing gear was damaged. Is that a big deal or a minor inconvenience?
It's a big deal. On a takeoff or a landing, you could have a wheel separation, which could cause this plane to go right off the runway and possibly flip over. It could be catastrophic.
Seeley showed that damaged part, a landing gear axle sleeve, to his supervisor.
We were told to change the tire assembly only and just forget about the sleeve. Just cover it up.
Seeley's partner refused to sign off to say that the proper repair had been made. He went to the FAA office here in Honolulu to tell them about the damaged landing gear that had not been fixed.
They took his story, but yet they didn't show up down at the hangar for until 3 weeks later.
He goes to the FAA and tells them that there's a plane flying in unsafe condition.
Yes.
They don't come out to Hawaiian for 3 weeks to see if his story checks out?
Yes, that's true.
The FAA inspector found that the landing gear part was damaged, just as Seeley's partner had said. The inspector also determined that Hawaiian's airplane had made nearly 1,000 flights in this unsafe condition. He proposed a fine of $1,000 for each unsafe flight, a total of almost $1 million. But he was overruled. The FAA proposed a fine of just $300,000, which could be reduced in negotiations with the airline. Meanwhile, Hawaiian continued to fly its airplanes.
So actually, this plane flew about 4 or 5 months in this condition. And the company didn't do anything to remedy it.
4 or 5 weeks?
Months.
Months. But when Seeley reported to the FAA 2 more DC-9s with damaged axle sleeves, they scheduled an inspection. However, before they could get there, the airline got rid of those damaged parts. The FAA decided to launch a full-scale investigation of Hawaiian. A special group was sent from Los Angeles to Honolulu. Heading up that team was Dave Colvin, a senior FAA maintenance inspector. And what Colvin's team uncovered, among other things, was testing equipment that had no record of ever being calibrated.
Take an altimeter, for example. If your calibration master is off, you could get to an altitude and not be at that altitude.
So you could be reading, I'm flying here at 25,000 feet and actually be
at 30, say. Or you could be at 20.
Colvin's team also found Hawaiian's repair shops in a mess. Good parts, broken parts, and scrap parts were all mixed together with no tags to identify them. So what happens when you've got a mechanic trying to get a quick repair on a plane to get it back out into service? Could he take the wrong part?
He very easily could take the wrong part, install this on the airplane, and ultimately cause the airplane to crash in the worst scenario.
While Hawaiian continued to fly, the FAA gave the airline a chance to correct all those safety violations, or as they say in FAA jargon, to close them out. But Colvin's team, which found the violations, didn't oversee the corrections. They were sent home. And once again, Hawaiian was under the supervision of the local FAA, the very same group that had let the airline slide all those years. The FAA says clean up your act.
Yes.
Hawaiian Airlines says we've done it. The local FAA people out there in Hawaii check it, say everything's okay. The FAA gives them their good housekeeping seal of approval.
Correct.
And that was the end of it.
And that was the end.
But it wasn't the end of the matter. Less than a year later, the Defense Department conducted its own safety inspection of Hawaiian because the airline had a contract to carry troops. Their investigation found many of the same problems that the FAA had uncovered back in 1988 and said had been fixed. The Defense Department declined our request for an interview but said its report speaks for itself. The Pentagon concluded, and this is a quote, Hawaiian's maintenance program does not currently meet industry standards. What I don't understand is how could Hawaiian be given a clean bill of health by the FAA?
Hawaiian would send a letter back to FAA saying, yes, we corrected this violation, but the FAA never came down to visually inspect and see that this defect was corrected.
As you can imagine, we had a lot of questions for Hawaiian Airlines. We wanted to ask them about the allegations of shoddy or unsafe maintenance. However, they declined our request for an interview. That's understandable, but why would the FAA, the agency that's supposed to look out for the traveling public, refuse to be interviewed? An official of the agency said the subject was, and we quote, too complicated to be discussed on TV.
No, it's not too complicated a subject to discuss. Maybe too painful a subject.
Congressman James Oberstar is chairman of the House Aviation Subcommittee. He says in the case of Hawaiian Airlines, the FAA simply failed to enforce federal air safety standards.
There were problems, serious, deep problems in the maintenance program of Hawaiian Airlines.
Do you think that there are other airlines with Hawaiian's problems that the FAA has been letting slip through the cracks?
I know they let Galaxy Airlines go too long. Now, that was a two-bit carrier, admittedly, but it managed to kill 69 people. Somehow went on to get contracts with the Defense Department to carry spare parts. They were found transferring oil from one engine to another engine that had been leaking oil. And the Air Force reported this to the FAA, and still it wasn't the FAA that shut this little two-bit carrier down. It was the insurance company that refused to extend their insurance, and the FAA finally shut them down. It shouldn't take that kind of action. The FAA ought to have a get-tough attitude.
And no one believes that more than Ken Mead, who heads the Department of the General Accounting Office that checks on the FAA for Congress. Over and over again, the GAO has written critical reports on how poorly the FAA is performing. Their latest report charges the Federal Aviation Administration doesn't always know if crucial repairs have been made or haven't been made.
For example, in the case of one airline, they flew two of their aircraft for 5 years with a defective landing gear.
For 5 years?
For 5 years. Now, FAA found out about the non-compliance with the airworthiness directive in that case because it was an accident. A landing gear collapsed.
Do you think that the FAA has the personnel it needs to do proper inspections?
I think that's a problem. We found that the FAA inspectors were getting half the training the FAA said their people needed. But just recently, the FAA is saying that they think this situation will continue on the training front for another 2 or 3 years.
But we've been told that in these days of deregulation, that when an airline feels the squeeze on its profits, one of the first things to cut back on, because it's not so visible, is maintenance.
We are now in a period of severe economic difficulty for the whole airline industry. Every carrier is going to be losing money. And this is a time when increased, not reduced, vigilance is needed on the part of the FAA.
And Hawaiian Airlines has been an airline that's been in financial difficulty.
And that is a tripwire. That should send up the red flag immediately to the FAA, but in this case, they didn't take heed sufficiently of those warning signs.
Did Hawaiian pull the wool over the FAA's eyes?
I would say yes.
Is it possible that the FAA is trying to whitewash this whole thing?
It looks like it is to me.